Welcome to State of Mind, being human and living well.
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 I'm Deborah Sloss, your host, producer, and licensed marriage and family therapist. My pronouns are she, her. Today's show is part of a series of shows we've made on trauma and nervous system recovery. For related discussions, you may want to check out episode 39 on healing through yoga therapy after trauma, episodes 42 and 43, where we explore the many ways people reset their nervous systems and build resilience, and episode 67 on healing from childhood sexual abuse. In the United States, an estimated 70% of adults have experienced a traumatic event, and its impact can extend far beyond the moment it occurred. Trauma leaves a profound imprint on the nervous system, often triggering a hyperarousal state characterized by chronic anxiety, stress, and heightened reactivity, or a shutdown mode marked by depression, fatigue, and withdrawal, or sometimes both in a cyclical pattern. These physiological responses are not just fleeting. Over time, trauma rewires the brain, altering how individuals process emotions, manage stress, and even maintain physical health. Understanding these effects is crucial in addressing the complex interplay between trauma, mental well-being, and long-term health outcomes. But there's hope. Our nervous systems can recover, and today's guests will share insights on how we can support that healing. Abbey Asher is an Iyengar-inspired yoga teacher in Santa Cruz, California, with 30 years of practice. Originally a dancer, Abbey turned to yoga to heal from personal losses, including the passing of her father and husband. She now helps others discover the power of movement, breath, and body awareness, particularly through active and restorative yoga for seasoned adults. She also spent 28 years at the University of California at Santa Cruz, where she connected students with meaningful volunteer opportunities. Karen Ouse is a licensed marriage and family therapist in Aptos, California, specializing in trauma therapy. She uses a unique blend of top-down and bottom-up approaches, incorporating somatic experiencing, the NARM model, and intuition to help clients reconnect with themselves and heal from deep identity wounds. With a background in dance, performing arts, and craniosacral therapy, Karen brings a rich understanding of nervous system healing. She's also a mother enjoying time with her child and their beloved pets, a husky named Blitz and a gray tabby named Samson. I want to welcome both Abbey and Karen to State of Mind. Thanks so much for being here with us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Delighted to be here and happy to have this conversation.
Well, I'm thinking, Karen, I'd like to get started with you. As a therapist, you've focused on trauma and the expression of mental health conditions in the body. And so you have a lot of experience with what central nervous system activation looks like and what trauma looks like. So I'm wondering if you could define what trauma is in the body, what it looks like, and what some of the conditions or situations that might cause it are.
So trauma it's a lot of ways that it can be defined. One of the working definitions when I was going through my somatic experiencing training is that it's energy that is all about survival that gets trapped and stored in the nervous system when the self-protective motor responses are thwarted and didn't get to complete. For example, if you're in a car and somebody T-bones you, right? If there had been time to self-protect, a person would orient and take action to move out of the way. And there would be a high level of arousal in the nervous system that later would probably be discharged through shaking and crying. But that would be a successful completion of trauma prevention. Usually what happens is these things happen to us without time to orient and prepare and organize. And so all of that arousal gets trapped. And months later, people start having these flashbacks or startle responses and nightmares because they haven't completed what was needed to have happened in the moment of the high intensity event.
So it's interesting because if I'm listening to you, it's sounding like trauma isn't necessarily in the event itself, and it's in how one experiences it.
That's right. And what kinds of opportunities and resources were available at the time to survive, to prevent something bad from happening.
It's a great description. Thank you, Karen. I'm wondering what you could say. What happens to the central nervous system if that kind of activation goes on and on without a chance to rest or reset?
That's a really good question, and that's pretty much what I see in my practice. Whether it was a high impact event or some other type of trauma, as you mentioned earlier, you know, poor relationships, where there's domestic violence, a sudden loss or grief. All of these things can impact the nervous system, and over time, there's this cumulative stress that happens when the person, who I'm going to now refer to as an organism, right? The organism is trying to adapt and survive to these circumstances. And without the right support, these adaptations become strategies that don't allow the person to really stay present to and process the painful feelings.
So it sounds like you're saying, in a way, it becomes self-sustaining even when maybe the trigger for it is over or gone.
That's exactly right. And you asked earlier, like, what does this do, this disorganization do to a person? And really, it affects a person's sense of self, because we look at who we were before an event, let's say, going along, functioning well. And then after this event, we lose functionality. We lose our ability to connect with and relate to other people. And then we tell ourselves a story about who we are now. And usually it's a pretty negative self-perception where a person starts running these programs of, I just need to this, if only I could this, I used to be able to this, I can't do anything anymore. And that becomes the primary identification of self. And that leads to depression. That leads to angry outbursts. And then the people around them can't understand. And if we just focus on the behavior, it's an egregious misattunement to what's happening to the person, and they feel further isolated.
So, Abby, I invited you to be a guest on the show after you had told me about your husband's sudden stroke and his diagnosis with a brain tumor. And you were describing to me how your nervous system got so activated that you were experiencing, physical and emotional pain. I'm wondering if you could share with us what happened and what your life looked like and what was going on in your mind and body as you found a way to get through those years without coming apart yourself.
Yes, sure. So let me just describe my relationship with Eric, who was my husband, who this happened to. We were a really happy, healthy couple in our early 50s. This is 11 years ago when this happened. And Eric had been experiencing headaches, but Eric was a hypochondriac. And so I didn't take this very seriously. Although what was a little different was he was being awakened at night with headaches, which was weird. Usually you could go to sleep with a headache and you wake up, you're okay. But he was being awakened or kept awake by headaches. So then he collapsed. He was in the East Bay helping one of his brothers move. The three brothers, I called them the Shapiro brothers, were together, and they were moving one of the brothers out of his place into another. Eric collapsed. They called the paramedics. The paramedics came. They were looking for a heart attack, which would be a typical thing, right? They found nothing. And they said, oh, well. And Eric revived and was, a little dizzy and disoriented, but he came back, and then they left, and they said, if you want to take him to the ER, you can, but whatever. Okay, so then Eric comes back to Santa Cruz. I walk in the door and he vomits all over the place, and it was, what's happening? So I took him to urgent care. Long story short, we ended up in the ER where they put him in front because of the kind of symptoms he was having. I was kind of in denial about this whole thing. As Eric was describing how he felt, I was very dismissive. And that is my way. I put blinders on. I do that a lot. I just try to shut out something that could be scary. So anyway, he ended up in the hospital. They did a CAT scan. Sure enough, a giant tumor. So that's when I really felt my heart, my chest gripping. But prior to that, Eric said on the way to the hospital, I think there's something terribly wrong with me. And when he said that, I believed him. That time I believed him because I knew this was true. And so then what happened was really horrible. The surgeon, it was Saturday night, he says, the neurosurgeon, we'll wait till Monday to operate on Eric. Why? I'll have my A team there. And, this is the small town aspect of the story, And I'm like, okay, we'll give him anti-inflammatories, we'll be fine Monday. This is Saturday night, right? So I somehow make it home, call the brothers, we all are, one brother lives here. The other one was about to get on an airplane, but didn't and came. And so we made it through Sunday. Eric was writhing in pain in the hospital. We're with him. Anyway, what happened was very late that night, Sunday night, right? I'm in my bed and his older brother starts climbing the stairs. I'm awakened by his footsteps to say, we have to go to the hospital right now. Eric's getting operated on. So what happened was the tumor was started to make its way down the brainstem, and Eric had a massive stroke. And then the surgeon was called and he rushed over and they performed the surgery. But the end result was that Eric was very compromised. He was blind because of what, the nerve center down. I learned all this stuff about where the optic nerve center is. Yeah, he was completely blind and brain damaged as a result of this. So anyway, he was given a year to live, but he lived almost 4 years.
But you were living with this idea that he has a year to live.
Yeah, that's very key to the story. Of course it is, because in my mind, I'm gearing up for a year, knowing Eric's going to die, pulling, the troops, amass the troops, get the help, rev up, do this for a year. That was clearly a big part of this story, is that they were wrong about that, and I had to hire 24/7 caregivers. They moved into my house. That was so traumatic, just trying to find the right people with whom I felt I could live with. Woo, that was very hard. No privacy whatsoever. We're all living in this house together.
What was the effect? What would you say was going on in your body, in your mind? That's just sudden tragedy like this. Your whole life turned upside down. I definitely hear that.
Yes, turned upside down. And this was very strange because I really harked back to a term I had heard. I learned it during this time called ambiguous loss. And I'm sure you guys are familiar with that, but maybe your audience isn't. And Pauline Boss, right? She's this therapist, and she invented this term to be grieving somebody when they're still alive. That's one meaning. There's a couple different meanings. But I had already gone through this with my mother, who had dementia, and she was still alive during this time. And she was in this state. She didn't know what was going on, but it lasted for 14 years. So I was already in the middle of that with my mom. And then with Eric, I also experienced ambiguous loss because he wasn't the person I married. He was completely and utterly dependent upon me and his caregivers, and he was really no longer my husband. And I was so sad about losing Eric because he was truly my best friend, my soulmate. So that was a really weird thing, but kind of familiar, the ambiguous loss that I was experiencing. But what else? This had never happened to me before. My chest and throat, yes, I'd experienced that kind of thing before, but I had shooting pain going down my arms, from my chest all the way down to my arms. And that lasted for a really long time. I was in so much pain physically from that. The other thing that happened to me is I stopped eating. I couldn't eat. And I love eating. I love to eat, but couldn't allow myself to be satisfied by food. I couldn't allow myself that luxury of feeling satisfied or happy about food. So I just was eating little bits and pieces of things, but I would stop, and I couldn't enjoy my food at all. I also had insomnia. I could not sleep, and I was ruminating all the time. I kept playing this loop. And I learned, my therapist said right away, "You're ruminating." I said, "Ruminating? Tell me more." So the continuous loop of my life, this terrible thing that happened to me, kept playing, and I couldn't turn it off. I kept playing through the events that happened. What could I have done differently? What are we doing? What is my life like now? Oh my God, la la la, poor me, poor me. And I couldn't stop. And I also want to say, Eric and I, this is very important to the story. Eric and I were best friends. And one of the reasons is we had both experienced loss and trauma as children. He lost both of his parents in a plane crash, and I lost my dad in a car crash around the same time. But we didn't know each other then. But we met in junior high. Eric and I were like two magnets. We were best friends from then on, and because we understood each other. So we had this trauma that we had already experienced as kids that drew us together in the first place, And as a result, I think, that's why Eric was such a hypochondriac and thought something terrible was going to happen all the time, because he was carrying this with him.
Oh, Abby, thank you. I mean, just what a experience you went through. And I know that you also told me in that story that you did have a way to try to anchor yourself even while you were going through and having all those symptoms. Can you say a little bit about what you did to try to hold yourself together as you were navigating that really hard time?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. It's very important. I think it's related to how I survived as a kid. I was a dancer, a very serious dancer, and 11, right? I lost my dad, and I just threw myself into dance. And ironically, my dad was the one who knew that I needed to dance. He was really perceptive, and he saw how much energy I had as a child and said, "Abby needs to dance." And so because of him, I started dancing. And when he died, I just kept dancing, and that was my whole identity growing up, the dancer. And so knowing that I love movement and I have to move, I had, after my years of being a dancer were kind of over, I found yoga, which was another form of movement, but it had, another meaning to me at that time, because when I found yoga, I was a mother and I was looking for peace and quiet and some way to calm my nerves, because motherhood was not easy for me, but I loved the way it made me feel. And so I really anchored myself to yoga, during my years as a mother. And then when this tragedy occurred, I practiced all the more and used that, as well as swimming. I love water, and I've always been a huge swimmer. So I was swimming and practicing yoga all the time, and I didn't stop. And that was really helpful to me physically, because I know myself very well, and that helps me to move. I'm a grumpy person if I haven't moved in a day, through yoga, swimming, and I'm always that. I've always been that way, and I know that. So I didn't stop. I really kept practicing all that time.
You're listening to State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well. I'm your host, Deborah Sloss. Today we're exploring trauma's impact on the nervous system and ways to support healing in both mind and body. Our guest, yoga teacher Abbey Asher, shares how she cared for her own mental health while supporting her husband through his diagnosis of a brain tumor, sudden disability, and gradual decline. We're also joined by psychotherapist and trauma specialist Karen Ouse. Now, let's get back to our interview. Coming back from the break, Karen, I want to turn to you because I'm wondering, after you were listening to Abby's experience, can you get a description of what was happening in her nervous system and why and how the practice of yoga and swimming may have helped her?
Mm-hmm. Yes. And before I go into any, information or theory, I just want to acknowledge that I think it took a lot of courage for Abby to share her story. And that's something when working with clients who are coming to terms with their trauma, is affirming for them that what they're embarking upon, this process of working through it, takes a lot of courage, because there are a lot of painful feelings and sensations in the body and meanings that they make out of their experience, that are really, for some people, so overwhelming. It's what keeps them from taking the next steps. So, and I know Abby's been invited here as a guest, so you've already obtained her consent, but I do want to ask if it's okay for me to make some comments on what I heard based on your story. Because that's also something that I practice and weave into my trauma approach, is gathering and gaining consent along the way. Even once we've already had it, I like to ask my clients, how would it be if we then do this? So I just wanted to model that from the get-go. But one of the things that Abby described that is really common in trauma is the rumination that happens. And one of my teachers and mentors from the somatic experiencing training, Steve Hoskinson, used to say that when we're ruminating, we're trying to figure out, right? We're trying to figure out, what can we do? How do we get control over this? How do we get ahead of this? And he said, figuring out is the futile seduction of trauma. That it keeps the system revved, but it doesn't actually achieve what the organism or the system is attempting to create for itself, which is that big exhalation, that breath that reminds us that we are in this life right now. And I think one of the things that was so helpful for Abby through her own intuitive steps and her training and the support that she had was, these activity, moving her body. It's really hard to stay frozen or tense if you're having to breathe. And so working with breath, especially the diaphragm muscle, is something that's, I would say, fundamental when we start exploring the nervous system and noticing what's happening with the breath. I also want to say that denial is a really common coping strategy. It helps us to compartmentalize and focus on the immediate task at hand. Making the food, making these phone calls, getting to the doctor appointment. I don't have to deal with feelings right now because I've got a job to do. And the other thing that is very common when two people share a trauma at a similar time, or maybe it's the same event, is what we call trauma bonding. Relationships made out of these experiences that unite us. So it's not uncommon, and it's really sweet to hear Abby's story that this early trauma bonding actually resulted in a really, deep and intimate friendship and marriage.
I know, in addition to somatic or body-centered kind of approaches, you've also specialized in a type of therapy that looks at the relational aspects of trauma. And so I'm wondering, from that perspective, can you talk about the interface between like trauma and relational trauma?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when we think of trauma, most of us think of these big events: a natural disaster, a car accident, an attack, something sudden that isn't necessarily caused by or related to the people close to us. Relational trauma, or what we might call attachment trauma, is something that occurs, and it's probably more of what I see in my office than event trauma. But relational trauma happens within our family system. And there are developmental stages that, from birth until, adolescence, there are these crucial stages at which point, if we aren't met in a way that accurately and lovingly reflects and supports who we are, we develop these survival strategies, because what is most important to every single human being is the attachment relationship. We will die without it, especially in infancy. And then, children learn that if the primary caregiver is angry with them, children typically blame themselves before they fault their caregiver. And so what they end up doing is foreclosing their authentic self and developing these survival strategies that are intended to preserve the attachment relationship. And this work is called the neuroaffective relational model. We call it NARM. And it's founded by Larry Heller, Dr. Lawrence Heller. And it's been really helpful to understand what's driving a person's behavior. And loss of the attachment figure is almost always at the heart of it. And I'd like to add one more piece, which is similar to Dr. Heller's philosophy. Gabor Mate also talks about this. He says it is the universal human dilemma, the core dilemma of all humans, which is the split between authenticity and attachment. And because attachment makes us survive, it's what helps us to survive, children will always choose attachment over authenticity. And then you can see how when we grow up, we are fighting to try to get back to this sense of authentic self with these embedded and well-learned, well-conditioned survival strategies that are all about preserving the attachment figure or relationship. So that is different from the event. But if an event happens, because it disorganizes self, it's going to bring up a lot of those early attachment losses or threats to the attachment and threat to the self. So they kind of dovetail.
Maybe you want to talk a little bit about the ACEs work, and because that's exactly pertaining to what you're saying. People who have that sort of foundational relational trauma are pre-set up to experience more traumas through their life. So could you talk a little bit about what that is and how that works?
Yeah, so the ACE study stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences, and it was developed by a man named Vincent Folletti, I think back in I can't say exactly, I'm not a super good historian here, probably back in the 70s. And there's 10 categories of what constitutes an adverse childhood experience. And if you Google the ACE test, you can see these 10 categories. But they have to do with different types of abuse, a family member with a mental illness, divorce, all these categories.
Loss too.
Mm-hmm. Early tragic loss, a suicide, a family member or a loved one. And what they found is that if you have an ACE score of 3 or higher, you'll tend to see some symptomology or some clinical diagnoses. When you get to a score of 5 or 6, you'll start to see that there's medical conditions that arise: diabetes, autoimmune disorders, a higher propensity for substance use and suicidality. And that's because the more significant the stress on the central nervous system, the more desperate the individual comes to try to resolve that for themselves. And also at a point where the system becomes overwhelmed, that the body starts reacting. It's a whole other topic of how trauma can affect gene expression.
Abby, I'm just wondering, as Karen's been talking about how, sort of these distinctions between event traumas and how they're related to underlying relational traumas, Is there anything you'd want to say about your experience that just really comes up as you're listening to that and makes that make sense for you?
Well, I want to say that this is so interesting. I've always felt, from what Karen said, I've always felt that Eric developed a brain tumor because of the trauma that he experienced as a child, that his nervous system never really calmed down because, as I mentioned, he was one anxious guy. He never could be, and the slightest thing would get him going. If I went for a mammogram, a routine mammogram, he would be saying, "Have you heard back? Have you heard back? Have you heard back?" I mean, he always thought something terrible was going to happen. And I am convinced that he got this brain tumor and died because of his childhood trauma. And then it was really interesting because Karen just said that some people develop diabetes. If you look at the ACE model, well, Eric's older brother developed diabetes. Isn't that interesting? And I've never thought of it in that way. I always thought of Eric in that way, but not Mark, his older brother. Like, it was kind of weird that Mark got diabetes. He, as a college student, he was like 19. And God, lo and behold, it was probably because of his childhood trauma, using this model. So that's what occurred to me as I was listening to all of this. But maybe I'm not speaking to your question, but I just had to mention that because it brought that up for me. And I've said this to many people that I'm convinced that Eric got ill because of his trauma, and no one's ever really believed me. But I think it's true. I do.
I think you're probably not too far off. And again, in terms of understanding the central nervous system, our nervous systems, they like to be in this more parasympathetic state of resting, digesting, relaxing, but also responding to social things. So there's a little bit of sympathetic charge. And when I talk about sympathetic charge, I mean the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system, which governs the fight-flight response. But we also feel sympathetic activation when we're excited and happy and doing sports. So the central nervous system likes to be in this resting, digesting, playful, fun, ready to respond state. It's not designed to be in a chronic state of hyperarousal, which can happen to a child when they lose a parent at an early age. They get into this desperate state, and that creates a chronic stress on the nervous system. That means to the brain, there's a threat that I have to survive. There's a threat that I have to survive. And you can see how that then becomes an internal dialogue that's happening in the background all the time. And so the body responds to that. And that stress becomes a little toxic, which is probably, I'm kind of speaking in easy to understand terms. It creates this pressure that weakens the immune system so that other medical conditions that might normally lie dormant start to emerge.
Well, listen, I want to come to the part about recovery because, I promised in my intro that there is recovery from all of this that we're talking about. And so, Karen, I'm wondering if you could talk some about the ways in which trauma can be worked through and resolved.
Yeah. So in addition to trauma-informed therapy, a lot of the activities that Abbey described, right? These supplemental, it's not just one approach, but kind of a wraparound approach to healing are really useful. Meditation, exercise, going for walks in nature, they all can help, but it's in the therapy where the person starts to learn about themselves in a different way and learn to relate to themselves in a different way and to maybe begin to see this trauma as an opening for something new, because their life isn't going to be the same. The thing that happened changes everything. And so we as therapists are helping them grieve that loss, but also slowly building some foundation again so that they can re-engage and reconnect with their lives. And that is possible. And animals are also a really good resource in that process.
I think about also how often people will move into something like an advocacy role around something that they've been through, like, speaking about their experience or supporting others who have had similar experiences, and how that also seems to be part of people's healing trajectory.
That's very true. I want to say that I had this overwhelming need to help other people in the middle of my own trauma. I would hear about there were a couple people who were brought to my attention who were going through something similar. Really, another woman whose husband had glioblastoma who lived in the neighborhood, and he was the same age as Eric. And I reached out. I felt this need to reach out to other people, even though I was having such a hard time. It helped me. And I also want to say one thing that's super important. I became a writer during this time. I never was a writer before, but a friend set up a carrying bridge, the old carrying bridge, which is a great idea because I did not want to tell this story over and over again. And I didn't want to update people. It's a website where, if you have something going on and people want to know what's happening, you can just post and they can go there and read it without having to call you, have you explain it. So I took this on and it was so cathartic. I have to say, I loved writing. I wrote like every day and I posted these things. And after I'd write, I felt calm. I felt good. I always would write at night, or oftentimes when I just woke up, those 2 times. And it was completely a healing process for me to write. And I said after Eric died, I'm going to go back and look at all the writing I did, because I did it for years, and do something with it. I have not done that. I can't even bring myself to look at those, because I wrote about a lot of memories and a lot of beautiful things about Eric and me. And I said, I'm going to do something. And I haven't been able to do it. I haven't looked once at all those things I wrote. But it's interesting to me that I haven't managed to do it, because I retired from the university. I go, I'll have time. Nope, not doing it.
Well, it sounds like it was a lot more about the process than it was about some end product. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. That's such because now I don't write very much. I'm not compelled to write. I don't feel like writing now, but I did then.
And one of the things I'd like to add about a carrying bridge that some people utilize it for is they can have a friend be the advocate and ask the friend to give the posts and the updates.
Yes.
Somebody to help carry the weight of.
Yes.
And Karen, I'm wondering if you want to say something, because what Abby's talking about is also a common factor of healing from trauma, about the narrative. So I'm wondering if you'd like to say something about that.
Yeah. I think in the process of writing, especially the way that Abby did it, that we get to see, the evolution of our process, and who we are, we start to see isn't a fixed entity, but that there can be movement, and we can learn to be more in relationship with the changes and evolution of our sense of self. And I think that's very useful. Both writing and perhaps even like expressive art. I was going to say that earlier, and I wanted to make sure I included that.
And artistic expression, I think, is really important. And, and I remember that I felt compelled to make flower arrangements every day. I would go into my garden and pick flowers and put them all over the house. I did that daily. It was so therapeutic, and it added beauty to my surroundings, which I really cared about. As well as cooking. I had time to cook because I was home, and I involved Eric in cooking. We'd make yummy meals, something I really hadn't done so much of before. And so it was just, putting my hands on things and making something beautiful to look at or to eat. That was important as well for healing.
You're tuned to State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well. I'm your host, Deborah Sloss, and today we're exploring the impact of trauma on the central nervous system and ways to facilitate healing for both our minds and bodies. Joining us is yoga teacher Abbey Asher, who's sharing her journey of learning to attend to and care for her mental health while caring for her husband after his brain tumor diagnosis and the changes that followed. We'll also hear from psychotherapist and trauma specialist Karen Ouse, who provides insights into regulating and nurturing your central nervous system and offers valuable resources for support. Every State of Mind episode has a resource list, and any we talk about today are included in the show notes for this episode. We've also added transcriptions and closed captions. So go to www.stateofmindmedia.org to find all that. Now, let's get back to our interview. Karen, when I was talking to you about coming on the show, you were talking about how awareness of what's going on in our nervous systems can help us navigate and somewhat even reduce or prevent some degree of trauma. And I'm wondering if you could sort of describe that a little bit and let our listeners in on what some of that awareness that they might be exercising could be.
Absolutely. So let me start by saying, when I was listening to Abbey first share her story, I noticed I was holding my breath and I was just listening. And when I noticed that I was holding my breath, I made a point of taking a nice deep breath and exhaling. And as I started to do that, I felt tears come to my eyes, and I felt this emotion starting to move through me as I was really connecting in an empathetic way with what Abbey was sharing. And it's an example of what we do when we are working through trauma. We start paying attention to how we internally organize around an experience. And in somatic experiencing, that's largely through bringing sensation into our awareness, whether it's muscular tension, where we're noticing an emptiness or a hypotonic sensation, what we see, what we smell, what we hear. Are we hungry? Are we cold? And we really work to support a person's structure. I often tell people, how are you feeling as you're sitting here with me? Oh, I'm fine. And I say, well, let's just see if you really feel into your experience, could you be more supported if you had a pillow behind your back or a blanket? And sometimes I'm met with denial or resistance, but oftentimes when people are open to really checking that out, they realize, oh, wow. Now that I put that pillow behind my back, I feel like I can take a deep breath, and suddenly something new comes into their awareness, because now that they're in a more parasympathetic state, muscular tension starts to relax, their thoughts even change, right? We often say in this work that mental states match our felt sense states. So
our body states.
Our body state, that's right. So as we start to bring more awareness to these nuances and subtleties of our experience, we can start to identify, is this thing that I'm about to do or that I've been invited to do something that feels good to me? Or is it going to put me in overdrive where I have to go back into discomfort and function? Now I've got some choice. Whereas when we're in trauma, we often don't feel like we have any choice. So working towards really getting to know ourselves on these subtle levels helps create more choice, which means we can make a plan to do something that's more in our best interests.
I want to come back to you, Abbey, because we've been talking some about, Karen's been really giving us some beautiful information about how people recover from trauma. And I know that you had a whole collection of practices, and I'm wondering, what would you want to say about how you got through those incredibly hard 4 years?
Yes, I think that a lot of people are afraid to ask for help. And that's not me. I don't know where it comes from, but I've never hesitated to ask people to help me with things. And so I cried out to friends when this happened, and they rallied in the most beautiful way and set up systems, for delivering food, for visiting with Eric, because that's very important. One of the things I was most afraid of is that Eric would be so lonely and just have no stimulation whatsoever. And so we set up a whole structure for people visiting on a daily basis. So he had company, he had people to walk with him, to lead him on Westcliff. And there was a group that even set up something called Salon, which still exists today. They would be with Eric once a month and talk about topical issues, because Eric had no short-term memory. So they would read something and then talk. So Eric could feel in the world, because he was feeling like he wasn't contributing, and this added so much depth and meaning to his life. And I felt so happy to recognize the sense of community. But this schlepped on for almost 4 years. So at times that support would wane, but then friends would come around and rev it up again. All I needed to do was say something to a couple of close friends. People aren't visiting as much, or I'm feeling more isolated. What can we do? They'd Zoom in, organize another meeting, and rev it up again. I mean, this went on for a long time. So community, community, community. I can't say it enough. Don't isolate yourself. Ask for help. Draw upon your community if you can. But not everyone had all the friends that we had either. Eric was so loved. So people were there. So that's important. So important.
And, for some people, it may not be apparently evident, but it can be there. I have had clients, for instance, start going to a support group at a church and then find that that community really circles around them at times that they need. Or, sometimes you may not know that it's there, but when you actually extend yourself and ask, people sometimes will move in. So, yeah, and it's true that not everyone has that, and yet sometimes it can be kind of hard to see.
That's a good point. And people like to be asked. People have this notion that people you don't want to inconvenience people. No, au contraire. I think people want to be asked to help. I love being asked to help. I love it when people ask for my help.
Karen, I also want to come back to you as we're talking about healing and how recovery. And I know that you had a very specific and practical type practice that can help people sort of understand this connection with the nervous system. Did you want to introduce that now?
Sure. So the main focus of this is understanding the role of breath in our functioning and our health, and how that gets truncated when our systems are overwhelmed, and other parts of our nervous system are governing, such that this one muscle that's involved in breathing, the diaphragm, gets paralyzed. And the diaphragm is this dome-shaped muscle that's, if you follow your breastbone down to where your ribs start, right where your ribs start to separate into that upside down V, the diaphragm sits right underneath that. And when we inhale, our lungs expand, pushing the diaphragm down. And when we exhale, the lungs, deflate and the diaphragm floats back up. And so what we do, this one practice that Peter Levine calls it the VU exercise. And I'm sure it's used in other cultures, and it's not just created by him. But we make this sound, we pretend to be foghorns, and we take a deep breath in and we say, and then we rest at the bottom of that exhalation, and we wait for air to come back in and fill up the lungs again. And in that waiting, we're allowing the diaphragm to relax. And so when we inhale, then it contracts again and pushes down, and we say the VU sound again. We usually do this about 3 times. And then we wait, and the person just kind of notices, what does saying VU in that long extended exhalation, waiting for the inhalation to come back and take air in again. Like after 3 rounds of that, a person really can notice a difference. And by the 4th or 5th time, they may start to spontaneously breathe more deeply. And when we start breathing more deeply, we're accessing our parasympathetic nervous system. So we are shifting our state. Now, it takes some mindfulness. Not everybody responds the same way right away. It's not a big success or a noticeable success for each client. But with practice, it can be integrated and become its own practice. So then it's like a breathing meditation that people can do in their car, they can do before they go to bed, they can do it upon rising, and it really helps set the tone for how we enter into the next experience.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that really practical example. And I want to encourage listeners, you can go ahead and give that a try on your own later.
And I like to think of the diaphragm in that practice as either being a parachute, like a parachute, or a jellyfish, right? So it's supple and pliant, and it moves with the movement of air.
As we come to the end of our time together, I wonder if there's any final thoughts or comments you want to leave listeners with, or perhaps something that we just haven't yet had time to talk about that you want to mention. And Abby, we could start with you.
Yeah, I wrote down a few things I wanted to tell people about. I think that if you get into a very difficult situation, traumatic situation, remember these things. 1, you are stronger than you think you are. 2, don't be afraid to ask for help. 3, stay curious. And 4, learn to inhabit your body and pay attention to the cues that it's giving you.
That is a beautiful summary of what we've talked about today.
Absolutely. I don't know if I can really add much more to that, other than to include this piece that there is always something driving our behavior. And trauma is such a, it's so common that if you feel like you're going crazy or that something's wrong with you, please do some of these steps that Abby has suggested, and just understand that there's more to be understood about your experience, that it can get better.
Next, we hear from Kevin, who shares his unique approach to finding nervous system regulation as he helps himself heal from trauma. His perspective emphasizes that there are many different paths to healing and nurturing our well-being.
My name is Kevin. I'm 26, and when I was 10, I lived with an uncle who was abusive and struggled with drug abuse and alcoholism. He often had episodes, and during these episodes, I found myself taking charge and getting everyone to safety. That usually was my siblings, his wife, and my cousins. Later, I was able to move in with my dad and escape that environment, but it did leave me with a lot of trauma, dealt with nightmares, moments of overwhelming emotion. And so something that kind of helped me deal was therapy and diving into superhero stories, whether that was through video games, movies, and comic books. Diving into these stories kind of built resilience and hope. It helped me process and heal, and regain control of my nervous system. Something I could tell others going through something similar is that there's always a path forward, and sometimes it's just about finding the right stories to speak to you, that help you connect, and know that you're not alone, and healing is possible.
Thank you, Kevin. You've been listening to State of Mind, being human and living well.
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 I want to say a huge thank you to our guests today, Abbey Asher and Karen Ouse, and to our In Your Voice contributor, Kevin. And thanks to you for joining us. To learn more, check out the wealth of information included on the resource list in the show notes for this episode. If you found today's show interesting, you may also want to check out episode 39 on healing through yoga therapy after trauma, episodes 42 and 43 where we explore the many ways people reset their nervous systems and build resilience, and finally episode 67 on healing from childhood sexual abuse. New episodes of State of Mind exploring mental health and wellness are released the first Sunday of every month and can be found along with our complete archive on our website at www.stateofmindmedia.org. If you missed part of this episode or you just want to hear it again, subscribe to our podcast on all the major podcast platforms. Also, when you rate and review our podcast, you really do help it get found and heard by more listeners. So if you like this or any of our episodes, could you please do that for us? Special thanks to Vijay Luca and Yusuf Hassanain for audio production, Patrice Vecchione for In Your Voice story coaching, Rebecca Levy for media outreach, Sarah Altman for community outreach, and Katrina Tattenham for advanced research. And thanks to Adrian Legg for composing, performing, and donating the use of our theme music. State of Mind was developed and originally broadcast in association with KSQD-FM in Santa Cruz, California. We always want to hear from listeners and community members just like you. You can submit your very own In Your Voice recording and become part of the conversation just like Kevin did today by either calling in to leave a message or recording an audio file right on your phone. Either way, tell us about a mental health experience you've had, something that's contributed to your mental health recovery, or share a resource that's been helpful for you. We really do want to hear from you, and your voice may just be on one of our future shows. Submission details can be found at www.stateofmindmedia.org. Come on back and join us again next month for a whole new episode of State of Mind. Until then, live well.